Okay. Well, I usually like to start all of my presentations with just some group agreements. If you were here with us a couple of weeks ago, these are the same. But practicing compassion and curiosity, I think questions are amazing. So please ask lots of questions. It's better to ask them now than not know in the middle of a situation later. Remain respectful, embrace accountability, hold space for discomfort, practice self-care. Confidentiality, it sounds like Becca was talking about that too, especially since we are recording this training. So if you have specific questions or examples, that's totally fine. Just let's make sure that we're not using any type of identifying information, especially so that Becca can use this training in the future as well. And then I love this quote by Mia Mingus, and she says, "We need each other to end violence." So I like to start every presentation with that little quote. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about what is mandatory reporting in the first place. How do I recognize when there is something that I need to report? How do I make that report? And then what might happen after a report is filed? Okay, so mandatory reporting is basically just the legislative requirement for specific groups of people like you all to report suspected child abuse and neglect to government authorities. So you all are definitely mandatory reporters, and I have a list of some other, yeah, so here are some of the other types of people that are mandatory reporters. So medical professionals, first responders, dental professionals is an interesting one, teachers and professors, caregivers, photo developers, advocates, and bank personnel also are mandatory reporters. So about 75% of reports in Colorado, this is from a while ago, I couldn't find any data like this for more recently, but in 2013, 75% of reports of child abuse came from mandatory reporters. 15% of those reports came from family members, and only about 10% came from the general public. So mandatory reporting is a really important piece of making sure that these cases get brought to the appropriate people. Okay, so mandatory reporting covers children, so child abuse. So when you have a reasonable cause to know or suspect that a child has been subjected to abuse or neglect, or you've observed the child being subjected to circumstances or conditions that would reasonably result in abuse or neglect. All advocates are mandatory reporters for child abuse. So this is really important to think about how it's even if you suspect, so it's not like you have to see it happen, but if you even have a reasonable cause to suspect that it's happening, that falls under mandatory reporting. Are clergy mandatory reporters? I think so. I'm pretty sure they are. Yeah. Okay. So then we also have mandatory reporting for at-risk adults. I think this one is probably a little bit less familiar to most people. I'm going to talk about it in the next couple of slides, but basically it's the same as child abuse reporting, but just with a different group of people. So instead of kids, you're looking at-risk adults. So I'll go over that definition here in a minute. But it's the same thing. If you have a reasonable cause to know or suspect that an at-risk adult has been subjected to abuse or neglect, or you've observed the at-risk adult being subjected to circumstances or conditions that would reasonably result in abuse or neglect. So most people who are mandatory reporters must also report at-risk adult abuse, and that includes you guys. Okay, so just because this is less familiar, like I was saying, I don't think I need to define a child for you all, but I think it can be important to define at-risk adult. I want you all to keep in mind through this slide and the next slide that these are very specific definitions to at-risk adult mandatory reporting, and that everything on this slide and the next slide is like very specific to those laws and is not representative of the language or the definitions that the disability community uses. There's actually some pretty offensive language in these definitions, just to warn you up front. And the really big important point that I want to make with this is that not all disabled people are at-risk adults. So you have to be very careful about making sure that the person, if you're concerned about at-risk adult abuse, that they meet these very specific requirements, because otherwise you're just infringing on a disabled person's confidentiality and rights and that sort of thing. So you have to be very careful, make sure you know that not all disabled people are at-risk adults. So what is their definition of at-risk adults? So if somebody is unable to walk, see, hear, or speak, unable to breathe without mechanical assistance, if they have an intellectual and developmental disability, which I'll go over on the next slide, if they have a mental health disorder, which includes one or more substantial disorders of the cognitive, volitional, or emotional processes that grossly impairs judgment or capacity to recognize reality or to control behavior. So that definition is a little bit long and complicated, but again, it's not covering like every single person who has a mental health disorder. So it's not just anybody that has depression or anxiety or PTSD or schizophrenia. It has to be something that is substantially impairing judgment or capacity to recognize reality. So we don't want to be just making all these reports for people that have mental health disabilities or disorders. And then we have mental impairment. So behavioral, mental, or psychological disorders, such as an intellectual and developmental disability, organic brain syndrome, behavioral or mental health disorder, or a specific learning disability. So same thing with that. And then somebody who's receiving care and treatment for a developmental disability. Chat here. And apparently not elderly without at least one of the listed factors. Yeah, I think that elder abuse is still gonna be mandatory if the person is over 70, even if they don't meet these factors. Okay, yeah, so all people in Colorado over 70 are considered at-risk adults. Okay. So what is the definition of intellectual and developmental disability from the last slide? So again, disclaimer, this is really not an appropriate definition for the community, so don't use this language colloquially, but this is the law. So an at-risk adult definition of intellectual developmental disability is a disability that manifests before the person reaches 22 years old, that constitutes a substantial disability to the affected person, and that is attributable to mental retardation or related conditions, which include cerebral palsy, epilepsy, autism, or other neurological conditions, when those conditions result in impairment of general intellectual functioning or adaptive behavior similar to that of a person with mental retardation. So again, it's the same thing. Not every person that has one of these conditions or identifies with one of these conditions is an at-risk adult. It has to meet this impairment of general intellectual functioning. So some other definitions that I think are more useful than this one are basically any substantial functional limitations in 3 or more areas that are present before age of 22. So those areas that you're going to look for 3 or more checkboxes on are self-care. So is this person able to kind of care for themselves, take care of their daily living tasks, that sort of thing? Receptive and expressive language, so are they able to communicate? Learning, mobility, self-direction, and capacity for independent living. So if you are concerned about multiple of those categories, then that is when you want to start thinking about this person as an at-risk adult. Many definitions of intellectual and developmental disability include an IQ cutoff of 70. So that's not necessarily something that you would know just from working with or talking to a person, but some things you can kind of ask to start to figure this out. If you're starting to be a little bit concerned, you can ask questions like, did you have an IEP plan in school? Or do you use a caregiver, or do you need help with your daily tasks? So you can kind of ask some of those questions. And actually, a lot of people who have developmental disabilities, by definition, have been diagnosed with that before they were 22 years old. So a lot of people with intellectual developmental disabilities know that they like have that label, IDD, or intellectual developmental disability. So you can just ask. It's not an offensive question because it's not a bad thing to have an intellectual developmental disability.
Zoe, we also have a question
Yeah.
about a chronic alcoholic or a drug addict.
That is a good question. Um, I'm not sure. I know it definitely counts as a disability in a lot of cases, but I don't think that it would fall under this definition of disability. It might. That's a good question. Let me look that up and send you an email after this.
And then Cindy also asked
Yeah.
if the disability must be manifest before age 22 to fall within the mandatory range.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of confusingly worded. So for an at-risk adult, it does not have to. So like we were saying, anybody over 70 is automatically an at-risk adult. And if they meet any of these on this slide, those things don't have to have been diagnosed before 22. But this one particular bullet point, which is probably going to be the most common one with at-risk adult reporting other than age, that one, intellectual developmental disability, that in order to meet that definition, it has to have been present before 22 years old. Does that distinction make sense? So not all at-risk adults have had the thing that makes them at risk for their whole lives, but people with intellectual developmental disabilities do. Does that answer your question, Cindy? Mental health due
Yeah,
to
I
age.
just wondered if the mental health has to be manifested before age 22 or age 70. I wouldn't think so, but
Yeah, so the things on this slide here, these are regardless of age. So anybody over the age of 18, because under 18, that's just child reporting. But over the age of 18, if somebody has any of these things, regardless of their age,
okay,
or over 70. So it's
great.
a pretty broad category. So if somebody maybe started having mental health disabilities in their 50s, and they substantially impaired their capacity to recognize reality from this definition, then they would still be considered an at-risk adult, even though that came on after they were 22 and they're not yet 70. Does that make sense? Okay. These are great questions. Thank you for asking them.
Zoe, do you mind if I chime in for 1 second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to let everybody know that this is really great, exhaustive information of everything that goes into mandatory reporting at a larger level. Most of you won't come into situations where you have to report on at-risk adults. It's more likely that you might have to figure out, who do I tell when it comes to my kiddo and the at-risk situation that child is in? So don't feel like you have to memorize all of these bullet points and internalize it. This is just really great. I don't know all of this either, but it's really helpful to know it at the bigger picture level, and that's what we're trying to do here today. Feel free to take as many notes as you want, of course, and to internalize as much as you possibly can, but I just wanted to put anybody at ease that might be thinking, oh my gosh, I can't start my case until I memorize all of this. No, that's not true. And we'll go through, after she does her presentation, a little bit about where this all comes from. What does it mean? Why are we mandatory reporters? Where does that come from? Where does that duty come from? And what's the issue of erroneously reporting? Well, it's because of our duty of confidentiality. And we'll go through that. And Zoe's talking about victim advocates in general, which encompasses many advocates that also advocate for adults. And we advocate for children specifically. So we'll get back to just CASA specific stuff. Don't stop asking questions. I'm learning as well and loving it. But just in case anybody was a little nervous about the specifics of all of this, wanted to put anyone at ease. And thank you, Zoe. This is all really enlightening and helpful for me too.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yes, absolutely. I am definitely anticipating that this information would be used pretty rarely for you all, but it is still a requirement as an advocate. So it's good to know, just in case it comes up. Just to give you like a look forward at the rest of these slides, everything else is going to be pretty much the same, whether it's an at-risk adult or a child. So that's why I had these definitions at the beginning, but pretty much everything from here on out is going to be the same, no matter if it's a child or an at-risk adult. It's just a different phone number you call. Yeah, so hopefully that helps clarify a little bit, and let's just keep going. Okay, so how do I recognize when to report abuse? So what are we even looking for? So things that need to be reported are physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse, financial exploitation, and neglect. And we're going to go over all of those. So some signs of physical abuse might be bruising, broken bones. They might wear out of season clothing, so long sleeves to kind of cover abuse or like marks on their arms. They might not leave their home very often. They might wear dark sunglasses, again, to cover bruising. So these are things that we're going to be looking for kind of physically if you are in the same room with a person. Some signs of mental abuse could include things like constant apologizing. They might be upset by small disagreements. They might not speak or act the way or do the things that they used to do. They might have a really heightened fight, flight, or freeze response or stress response. They might be really jumpy, and they might be withdrawn from social activities that they usually participated in. Some signs of sexual abuse could be sexually transmitted diseases, bruising on kind of the inner thighs or chest, or strange spots on clothes or linen. So again, a lot of these things are things that you would be looking for like physically if you're standing or in front of a person or a child. But of course, all of these different things I would guess are more likely that you're going to hear them from somebody telling you about it, maybe on accident, maybe on purpose, but these are just things that you can look for physically. So signs of neglect might be a lack of basic needs and care. They might lack prescription or medical attention. They might not have a clean home, or they might be denied hygiene or hygienic practices. They might be lacking housing, appropriate housing. So all of those can be signs of neglect. Okay, so maybe you've seen something like that, or the child has said something. So what do you do next? So for all of these things, like I said, the process is going to be very, very similar for if it's an at-risk adult, but I'm going to keep using the language of just child abuse just to keep it simple, and because that's the most relevant for you all. But just keep in mind, back of your head, if you hear about an at-risk adult, it's the same process. So you're going to report to either law enforcement or the child abuse hotline. It really depends on the county. Some of them prefer one versus the other. It should say on the CPS website what you should do depending on what county the person lives in. And you have to do this within 24 hours of witnessing or becoming aware of the mistreatment. So even if maybe you become aware of the mistreatment at 4 o'clock on Friday, you have until 4 o'clock on Saturday, even if you're not working. So it's not business hours, it's literally 24 hours. You will be anonymous through CPS, but not necessarily through law enforcement. I mean, you can definitely request to be anonymous or for them to be sensitive with sharing that information, but they can't guarantee it the way that CPS does. So some of the things that they might ask you about when you make that call. So these are all things that you're going to want to kind of take notes on if you start to realize in the middle of a conversation, oh, wait a second, this is probably going to be a mandatory report. You're going to want to take notes on all of these things. So the child's name, demographic info. So oftentimes they're going to ask for race or ethnicity. And also they usually ask for any, like, I think the question is, are there any cultural considerations for the social worker going into the home? And location. You're also going to want to do the name and address of the person responsible for the suspected abuse or neglect, if you know it. The nature and extent of the child's injuries. So basically, what happened? What did you see? Or what did you hear? What did they tell you? Family composition. So they usually want to know who else is in the home. Who told you about it? So that could either be the child, maybe that's a relative, whoever it is, they're going to want to know who made you aware. Any action taken by the reporting source. So this is a really interesting one where basically they're just wanting to kind of see like what has already happened, what has the person already done to try and address the situation. And then any other information that may be helpful. And this is all with the caveat of confidentiality. So even though we're talking about mandatory reporting, our clients still have confidentiality throughout that process. And this gets kind of complicated because, and I have a section on the next slide, Mara, for you to talk more about it if you want to, but the client still has this confidentiality, and any like mandatory reporting things need to absolutely take into consideration confidentiality. So anything kind of outside of these questions, you're going to want to be a little bit hesitant. Like sometimes on the phone, I have had CPS staff ask me really inappropriate questions about our clients, about their situations, about like whatever else is going on in their lives, about their insurance information, like all of that sort of stuff. And if you're getting questions that really fall outside of this, that's a good time to say, I am not sure if I am allowed to give you that information because of confidentiality. Let me put you on hold and check with my supervisor or something like that, because you still definitely have that confidentiality requirement. But mandatory reporting is kind of like a very narrow exception underneath that confidentiality. So some of the ways that this shows up, especially for us, we do a lot of adult victim advocacy, so lots of domestic violence situations. So a lot of the times that we hear about child abuse, it's from a parent who is in a confidential shelter location. So this might come up for you all, it might not. But if somebody is in a confidential shelter location for their safety, that's confidential. And so what you can do when they ask about the location is you can provide the name of the program. So you can say, oh, they're staying at Gateway Shelter, or they're staying at Crossroads, or whatever the safe house or shelter is, if it has a confidential location, and just say it's a confidential location. Because to be honest with you, even though I've been doing this work for a while and work very closely with all of these shelters, I don't know where a lot of them are. I don't have access to their addresses. So just make sure that you're not providing those specific addresses because they work really, really hard to keep those confidential. Okay, so what happens if you don't report? So if you don't make it within that 24 hours, you personally and or the agency or the agency staff, so the CASA staff and CASA itself, could be held responsible and charged with a Class 3 misdemeanor. You could be fined $750 or put in jail for 6 months. You can be liable for what is called damages approximately caused. So basically, you can be held responsible for what happens if you don't report. So it's really important to make these reports within 24 hours. And then the last piece on this part is do not knowingly make a false report. So even if you aren't sure about something, but you have a suspicion, you still need to report that, and you're going to be protected because you are making that report in good faith. But what we don't want to do is make false reports, which I'm sure is not going to be difficult for any of us. I don't know why anybody would knowingly make a false report as an advocate, but just know that that is definitely not okay. Don't make false reports. Any questions about this slide? So what do you do in the moment? And Mara, I copy pasted this sentence that you sent me over email as an example of what to say. But so some of the things that we tell our staff to do in the moment is if you have any concerns, immediately tell a supervisor. And I'm not sure if that's an internal policy you all have, but I think it's really important to make sure that everybody, especially staff, if you're a volunteer, is made aware of the situation. So make sure you tell somebody else. While you're on the call, you can interrupt the client, remind them that you are a mandatory reporter. And if they continue, let them know that you are going to need to make a report. You can offer to make that call together, especially if they're an adult. I think it would probably be best judgment if you're working with a child. You might not want to make that call together with them, but sometimes that can be really empowering, especially if you're working with teenagers or adults, to have them make that report themselves. And then also always offer a safety plan, because mandatory reporting can sometimes bring up some safety concerns. Abusers can get more abusive after a mandatory report is made, especially if nothing is able to be done after that. So you want to make sure that you're talking about how to keep yourself safe after that report is made. And then offer to let them speak with a supervisor if they're confused or concerned or upset about you saying that you need to make a mandatory report. You can always offer to let them talk to somebody else. Mara, do you want to read this quote that you sent me of an example of what you might say to a child?
Sure. I've heard lots of questions through the years from different CASAs about, my CASA told me this, but they said I can't tell anybody, whether it's because they don't want the CASA to tell anybody or the child is confused about the CASA's ability to tell anybody about it. And we'll touch on that a little bit later as whether or not that's a privileged relationship and communication, which it's not. It falls under confidentiality. But an exception to confidentiality, as Zoe has showed us through her slides and through this presentation, an exception to that confidentiality is mandatory reporting. So I just like to go through, all of this can be overwhelming. I like to do lots of examples. So something that I imagine I would say is, I'm so glad you felt safe enough to tell me that. I'm your CASA, and that means I care about you, and it's my responsibility to make sure you're safe and healthy. And I can never promise to keep secrets. I won't tell anyone that doesn't need to know, but I'll have to tell your caseworker. And have you talked to your therapist about this, or talked to anyone about this? Something like that. And of course, keep in mind, you would change your language to reflect the developmental stage that your child is in. You might have to lengthen it, shorten it, things like that.
Yeah, I love this first sentence too, that I'm so glad you felt safe enough to tell me that. We use that all the time also with our clients. Just like, yeah, affirming that relationship and the safety that they have with you. Okay, so some other things. So you're in the moment, you've just heard something, you've just said that quote, and what you're going to want to do next is ask for those necessary details. So get all of that demographic information, family composition. You might already know a lot of that if it's on file, but things like location, exactly what happened, that sort of thing, you're going to want to ask for some more detail. If it's an emergency, you're always going to call 911 no matter what. But if it is not a emergent situation in that moment, you're going to want to call the child abuse hotline. So this is the number. It's the same number for all the counties to make it super simple. APS is a little bit different. Again, hopefully you won't run into this very often, but if you happen to, you're going to want to Google the local county APS number. And APS stands for Adult Protection Services. the hotline phone answerer, the person on the hotline, they might tell you to call the police also. And what you're going to want to do when you are on the phone making a mandatory report, you're always going to want to ask for the report ID number or the hotline number. So this is just like a case. It's not necessarily a case number, but it's a number that identifies the report. And that's really important to keep for your records and in CASA's records, just in case something ever comes up and someone's ever wondering if you fulfilled your mandatory reporting obligation for that situation. You can say, yes, here's the report ID number from when I made that call. And then you're also usually going to want to call the non-emergency police number for their area. And again, that's a question you're going to probably want to ask the hotline. It depends. I've gotten different answers. Basically, every time I've ever made a CPS report, they have me do something a little bit different. So be flexible, be prepared for them to tell you something a little bit different than you're used to, just because it does vary county to county and person to person, whoever is on the hotline. Just make sure you keep a record of whatever you've done and whatever they told you to do. Yeah, and then carefully log the report, including that ID number. And I always think it's super important to recognize that making a CPS report or an APS report can be really, really stressful on you also as an advocate. So make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Take a break afterwards if you can, eat, tell a coworker about it. Don't carry it all by yourself, I think is the biggest thing. Make sure you're talking to other people about it within the organization. Okay, so here I put this, Mara, I just took a couple of bullet points from the email you sent me, so I hope I captured a lot of what you wanted to cover. Take as long as you want to go over these things, but I will just say on the first bullet point, if there's ever at-risk adult abuse, that's a really great referral for us at the initiative. So if you're aware of it, have them give us a call or make that call together with them to us. So yeah, Mara, do you want to cover a couple of these points?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for capturing that on there. That's great and helped me to organize my thoughts a little bit. That was really fantastic, and I think we all have a better understanding of this duty that we have. Yeah. But I want to back it up because if any of you are like me, you really need to understand big picture to then be able to understand the specifics. So why are you a mandatory reporter now? We saw that slide that Zoe showed earlier on of these are all the different types of people that are mandatory reporters. Where does that come from? Every state is going to have a statute that lists who needs to do this and the consequences. Then there's another stating the consequences if they don't, right? So here in Nebraska and almost every state, an advocate like this or a CASA would become a mandatory reporter. So we're listed under the victim advocate term. If you had, I saw there were some questions about who all specifically are mandatory reporters. You're welcome to look up that Colorado revised statute and you can see the bullet points there yourself. I don't have it all memorized, but if anybody wanted that, I could send that to you. So that's where your duty to be a mandatory reporter comes from. We talked a lot about your duty to be a duty to confidentiality. That comes from statute as well. So there's another statute and that's in the Children's Code, and that's what we're mainly governed by here. It mentions CASA specifically several times. The Children's Code is essentially a group of statutes grouped together under Colorado revised statutes that pertain to a particular area, such as the dependency and neglect cases that we're dealing with. And those are can be helpful to reference as well. So the duty of confidentiality comes from there. So it comes from the law, and then it's also written into the court order that will, the court order that assigns you to a case. Many of you aren't on a case yet, but when you pick a case and you're paired with your staff member that acts as your supervisor, they're called a senior program coordinator, they will go over that appointment order with you, and you can read it bullet point by bullet point, what you are now responsible for, what you must adhere to. And this is what the judge expects from you as a now officer of the court that is a party to this particular case. And it requires that you maintain confidentiality, not just for that child, but for any persons related to and a party to that case. So it's just very important that, and what that means is you have to keep information that you obtain because you're a CASA that you wouldn't otherwise know. You have to keep that, to yourself. You can only disclose it to appropriate people, not inappropriate people. So it's not a breach of confidentiality to talk to your senior program coordinator. So all of this that you're learning is fantastic. You need to know it. Write it down, keep learning. I encourage you actually to continue to take mandatory reporting trainings through the years. Always keep that a priority. But you do have the ability to talk to your senior program coordinator about this because they are privy to that information. A breach of confidentiality would be disclosing that information to inappropriate people, which might be family members, your own family members, like your spouse, your children. Inappropriate people might even include people on the case. If you are a CASA to a child and they tell you something, it might be inappropriate to tell their mom or dad about that, especially if they aren't in the custody, physical or legal, with those parents at that time. So these are just all things we need to consider, and it can get tricky sometimes, and I'd like to go through some examples. That sentence that we talked about before, where you say, thank you so much for feeling safe enough to tell me that. I do have to tell somebody because it's my job to keep you safe and healthy. That's in the example that I like to use. That's the response that I use when a child says, but you can't tell anybody that this is happening because you're my CASA and you're not allowed to. Well, the child sometimes will confuse your duty of confidentiality with a privileged communication or a privileged relationship, meaning you couldn't testify about them. They hold that right to that knowledge, that statement. And that's not there. So I try to caution CASAs against thinking, oh, well, maybe I can't even tell my senior program coordinator about this because my CASA child told me it, but she told me that I can't tell anybody. So keep in mind, that's not how it works. Not only is there the exception to that confidentiality, there's also not that privileged relationship there. But before you move forward, you can always talk to your senior program coordinator. Just make sure you do it very quickly so that you are within the appropriate amount of time frame of reporting. If you can't get a hold of your senior program coordinator right away, and it seems like something that you're not sure if you need to report on, you can always reach out to the program director or any of the other CASA staff there, and they can help you. And like Zoe said, if it is a situation of imminent harm, use your judgment. If you think the police need to be called, then the police need to be called. But otherwise, a staff person will be there to help you navigate all of this, and you two can figure that all out together. So what the second bullet point on there is duty to the court versus duty to the child. And that's really referencing that privilege that many people get confused about, thinking that there's a privileged relationship so they can't tell anybody. And that's not really the case. You have an obligation to disclose that information. That's why you're there. You just need to make sure that you're doing it in the appropriate way and not the inappropriate way. And then you're not breaching any type of confidentiality on your part. So we already talked about how mandatory reporting is the exception to confidentiality, and how does a child disclose abuse, direct versus indirect. Zoe also mentioned how the statute can be really open for interpretation, or very broad when it comes to, it's not just that you were told that this abuse and neglect is happening, if you have reason to believe or reason to suspect. So there's actually further trainings that you can do, and I'll tell you, I'll provide a link at the end of this training so that you guys can do some more research if you would like to now, or something to look into for future continued educations in upcoming years or later in this year. Is what are you looking for? Like the physical signs, again, bruising, but also are they telling you that something is not right, and you're getting something I like to call it like a spidey sense. You wouldn't want to jump the gun and immediately disrupt this family's life by making all of these reports on nothing. But if you do, a reasonable person would think that there might be abuse there. Again, talk to your supervisor and you can talk about what to do. that the Colorado hotline for reporting child abuse, write that down, always have it. But back to that original example, keep in mind, if you call the hotline, for the most part, they're probably going to tell you they already have an open case. Tell the caseworker. Why would I assign a new caseworker? The reason that I might still want you to call that hotline number is to prove that you did in fact fulfill your duty in that time, because it'll be recorded. So that's specifically something, especially if you weren't able to get a hold of your senior program coordinator, you didn't know to whom you should report this at the time. Keep in mind also keeping confidential information confidential. The address part that Zoe brought up is crucial. That's something that we say err on the side of do not provide addresses. Even when you're writing court reports, don't put the address in there, just refer to it, because you never know who shouldn't be privy to that information. And those are just always a higher level of keeping that confidential. But for the most part, what it's gonna look like, you're not sure if this arises to, oh, I need to fulfill my duty as a mandatory reporter. What do I do? You talk to your senior program coordinator, and they're going to tell you to talk to your team. And that team is going to be the caseworker and the guardian ad litem. Don't talk to the other attorneys on the team, because they do their job from a different perspective and not necessarily from your perspective, which is best interest of the child. But the guardian ad litem and the caseworker should be privy to all that same information that you are privy to, and telling them will complete your duty. I like to put it in writing and put it in an email so that it's documented when you told them how it happened, but also just to make sure that they are aware of that information prior to that just being in an email, maybe calling, texting, however you communicate with your team. And you will find a way that you all communicate best. Make sure that they know that, so that ultimately the reason why we are doing this, the reason why we're here, is that your child is safe and healthy and okay. So the bullet point, what if there's already a CPS case open? That speaks to that is, yes, we need to call the hotline, we need to be aware of that, but in reality, what it's gonna look like for you when you're on a case is that. Now, if you see abuse, even though you are a CASA volunteer, let's say you just see abuse that's totally unrelated to your case, you're at the grocery store and something horrific happens, you still have a duty to report that. And that would be more like the slide that you saw where it's about calling the hotline and doing all of that. You don't necessarily have that same duty of confidentiality there, because there's no relationship, you're not a party to that case. So you don't have to worry so much about, well, what are you disclosing, what are you not disclosing, but be aware that your duty goes beyond just your CASA case. You now, as a person, have this responsibility to report abuse when you see it. And then just to follow up again on some of the things that kids say when they say, like, maybe my other example is, I think in my head of more of like a teenager talking to you, and they're like, you can't tell anybody that you're my CASA, and that's privileged. Well, sometimes little kids might say things like that differently. Like, I have a secret to tell you. I always like to, whether it's a silly secret or a very serious secret, to remind kids that safe adults don't keep secrets. And you would need to tell somebody if it was necessary. So even before you know what the secret is, just making sure that you're establishing that relationship, and it helps prevent any type of feeling of betrayal from them. But I also like to give the example, we go through all of these dire situations, but you might come into a situation where they say, I have a secret to tell you. I like Tommy from my class, but you can't tell anybody because you're my CASA. Great opportunity to talk about how safe adults don't keep secrets, but of course you don't need to tell anybody that they like Tommy from their 6th grade class. It still would be inappropriate to go tell their uncle about it, because that would still be confidential information that they gave you that they didn't want other people to know. But there's no duty to report that nothing arises at that point. And of course, that's just a judgment call. It's a very silly example, but you can see how it can be expanded to understand even more complicated situations. And that's all I really have to relay. I was going to end, like I said, there's a link to mandatory reporting, a training that you can take where you get a certificate at the end. And that is through the Colorado State website for the Office of Children, Youth, and Families. And it's incredibly helpful for anybody that wants to go in a little more deeply or just have a better understanding. Again, this is something that is very important. In practice, it's going to be easier than you think. You just talk to your supervisor and figure it out, but it is incredibly important. And taking your roles seriously is absolutely necessary. And I suggest that people take this after it's been a year since they've done anything on mandatory training. And I really love this training because you can do it very much surface level, just read the slides and take the information, but you can also dig into articles and data, and you can watch a video on the legislative history when it comes to child abuse and neglect and how we deal with it on a governmental level.
Yeah, so I have a couple more slides, just kind of about the process, like what can you expect after you make that call? And this might be what has happened before you make that call. Maybe this is what happened, which led you to even working with the child in the first place. I'll just put the link to this this video in an email if you want to watch it later, but it's just from the Colorado for Kids website, which is the hotline website, and it has a really nice explanation. It's, I think, 5 or 6 minutes long about what the process is, but they also have, here's just a quick overview of it. Basically, when a report comes in on the hotline, the reports are reviewed and they're either screened in or out. To be honest with you, a majority of cases are screened out. So if you're kind of on the fence about making a report, they probably are going to screen it out anyways. So it's always best to err on the side of caution and make that report anyways. But if you are hesitant about it, just know that they also probably will be hesitant about it, and they are the ones who can make that decision. So then they're going to decide who needs to be involved. They'll go through their interview process. They're going to make a decision about if the report is substantiated or not. If it's substantiated, then they're going to continue their investigation. It'll go to whatever happens next, courts, go to a CASA advocate. All of those things happen, or it's closed out if they don't find that it's a substantiated report. And I think it's really important to note also that removing a child is always the last resort from CPS standpoint. So just so you know that that's not like what their goal is when they go in. Here's just a flow chart of what happens. Again, this is just on their website, so you can find this super easily. But basically, reports are screened in, or they're screened out. And then they kind of determine the safety concern level. They figure out who all needs to be involved. They look at evidence. If there is evidence or not, then they kind of go from there to maybe they close the case. If there isn't evidence, maybe the family gets referred to non-court related services. Maybe it goes to a court case. And that's when maybe the child is placed in out-of-home care, or the child stays with the family. And then they have the court process, which I'm sure you all are probably more familiar with than I am. But then after that, the goal is always to keep the child with the family. So this is kind of what happens after you make that call. And I think probably a lot of the kids you're working with are already somewhere in the middle of this process. And that's where Mara was talking about how you need to get in touch with your team and all the people who are already involved at whatever stage of this process the child is in. So then, yeah, so here's the number just one more time if you haven't written it down. If you are in Denver, this is the number you could call. You're going to want to look up local law enforcement when you're making that police report. Here's the ombudsman's number if you feel like something has been seriously mishandled. And then for APS, like I've said, there isn't a statewide hotline for that. So you're just going to have to Google the APS number for whatever county you're in. And that is all I have on mandatory reporting. Just a quick reminder of who we are at the initiative. Like I said, especially if you happen to hear about at-risk adult abuse, we're a great referral for that type of situation. So you can always send people our way. And just as a quick reminder, we serve folks who've experienced any type of abuse. So especially if you are working with a family where there's domestic violence or some sort of abuse going on with the parents, it can be really helpful to slip them our phone number as well. And we also offer other trainings, which you already know. And yeah, here's just a quick slide on when to refer to us. We are confidential advocates, so we actually do have a little bit higher, we do have that privileged relationship. So that can be a good resource for people who maybe do want to have that slightly higher level of confidentiality to work with an advocate like us. And that is all I have. And here's our contact information again, if you need it. And just like last time, I have a quick survey for you all. Just helps my boss and our funders know that we're out here doing what we say we're doing. And it should just take 30 seconds to fill out just a couple of questions about how comfortable you are with the concepts of mandatory reporting, and if you feel comfortable making referrals to the initiative. And that's all I have for you all.
So we had a quick question. Would you be willing to send out the slides? I can forward them onto the group.
Yes. Who should I send them to?
You can send them to me.
Okay. And I'm not seeing who is talking. Is that Becca?
Oh, so sorry, Becca.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, I will send slides to you. And then the other question I had was at-risk adults and substance use disorders. So I'm going to do some Googling on that and also try and find the answer to that question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, any last questions for me or for Mara or Becca? No.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody who's logged on and all of the really good information. I hope that clarifies a little bit. And any additional questions obviously can be directed towards me, Mara, or Zoe, if anything needs clarification. But thank you for logging on. And if you are attending live, I will put your hours in Optima. If you're watching this as a recording, it will be up to you to put your hours into Optima. So thank you all and have a good afternoon.
Thank
You
you.
too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.